The next speaker is Dr. Keith McNamara. His dissertation talk title is Testing Bias in Psychology, Law, and Public Policy, 1920 to 1980.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And thanks everyone for participating in the event. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Leslie, as well. So I want to start with a basic question. Some of you may have an opinion. Are standardized tests culturally biased? The answer to this question depends on who you ask. For many, the answer is yes. And they can point to a long history of abuses to back this up. From debates about intelligence testing during and after World War I to more recent court cases in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the idea that psychological tests are biased against certain groups has long been an assumption among many Americans. But if you ask specialists in psychometrics, the answer is often a qualified no. They might say that these tests have been thoroughly vetted to reduce or eliminate cultural bias, and that the question of whether a test is biased is strictly a technical psychometric one. Well, what accounts for these contradictory views? If claims about cultural bias aren't new, what explains the continued belief among many psychologists that ability tests continue to have valid application in measuring learning potential? How has the scientific legitimacy of these instruments survived despite repeated criticisms over the last century or more? To answer this, I searched through a wide range of archival and primary sources from the turn of the 20th century to the 1960s and the 1970s. Two main themes emerged from this research that I'll mention. First, testing bias was a perennial concern among psychologists from the beginnings of mental testing in the United States. The idea that tests might be invalid measures for certain socioeconomic, racial, linguistic, and cultural groups was a persistent threat to their legitimacy as objective scientific instruments. Second, how that legitimacy was threatened and the efforts that psychologists and others made to responding to claims of testing bias varied as the nature of these attacks shifted throughout the 20th century. In some cases, psychologists tried to improve the tests to make them more reliable or less prone to environmental influences. But what was constant was the belief that a purely objective assessment of native ability was possible so long as cultural interferences could be effectively neutralized. By the mid-1970s, following decades of attacks by various critics, civil rights activists, and litigants prepared to bring their grievances to Congress and the courts, psychologists carved out a narrower technical definition of test bias to protect the scientific legitimacy of the tests and their own professional credibility. Now, why does this matter? Since the 1930s, tests have been increasingly important to business, government, and education for purposes of diagnosis, selection, hiring, admission, promotion, and other important, often life-altering decisions. Thus, the stakes about whether the tests used are biased have been and remain high. And the idea that tests should be impartial, non-discriminatory, and maybe even equitable has been and continues to be central to their legitimacy. Thus, the fact that these core assumptions have been vigorously contested in a wide range of historical contexts speaks to the importance of carefully examining those contexts and how the nature of those debates have changed or stayed the same over the last century or more.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNamara.